Hello, dear friends. Today is the 2nd of July, Wednesday. And today, perhaps one of the main foreign policy topics of the American media is the decision of the Trump administration to stop or pre-stop the provision of military aid to Ukraine, specifically to stop the delivery of air defense funds to Ukraine, fearing their insufficient reserves in the United States of America. This is reported by Daily Beast and other media. According to the source of the Washington Post, the Ukrainian government was caught up in this step. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs urgently called on the U.S. ambassador to clarify from the Americans what is really happening. Well, what is happening, if you look at it with a broad view of what is happening in the battlefields in Ukraine, what Russia is doing. Russia has started a summer offensive, which is accompanied by unprecedented airstrikes on Ukraine, and most importantly, on civilian objects on cities. The enemy strikes on cities. And at this time, when it is especially necessary to close the sky above the head, when Zelensky specifically asked about this in his seemingly good meeting with Trump, the last one on G7, and Trump in one of the press conferences answering the question of the journalist related to Ukraine, made the impression as a person who sympathizes with the needs of Ukraine in additional Patriot missiles and promises to deal with this matter, although it is not easy. Well, this analysis ended with the fact that literally within a week, not that there is no talk of new supplies, but even what was allocated, as I understand it, by the Biden administration, what has now been stopped, is what should have been done according to the obligations that the Biden administration took on itself. Since the Trump administration did not take any new obligations on itself at all. Well, in fact, this is what the American media is paying attention to, that this is happening in the conditions when Russia sharply intensified air strikes on Ukraine, causing more and more intense missile and unmanned strikes across the country. The Kremlin's reaction to this message from Washington draws attention. Secretary of State Emily Apskov welcomed the suspension of the supply of weapons to Ukraine, saying on Wednesday that the fewer weapons supplied to Ukraine, the closer to the end of a special military operation. Well, I draw your attention to the fact that this happened, as I understand it, really unexpectedly for the authorities of Ukraine. It is even more strange that the strategic partners of the United States and Ukraine have an appropriate agreement on their part. Recently, an agreement on rare land minerals was signed, which, as they said from the White House, should give a new impulse to the strategic relations between the two countries. And here is such a surprise in the midst of when the country is under the growing blows of the enemy, the aggressor. Of course, they do not behave like this with a strategic partner. If you call things by their names, then this is a shame, this is betrayal, and in fact, this is how many media in the United States write. Shame, this is a raw story. There is such an addition, quite popular lately. Shame, 2 points, critics harshly condemn Trump for the last step that fulfills Putin's will, the quotes are closed. The White House has confirmed that it has suspended the supply of weapons that should have been transferred to Ukraine. Among them, the PAK-3 Patriots missile. It drew attention to the fact that in some reports it is mainly about PVO systems, and they are needed for the White House. Not only because they are not enough for the Pentagon, but also because Israel needs them. They have already been sent away in connection with the military conflict between Israel and Iran. Now they need new ones. From what I will tell you further, it is not only about the means of air defense, but also about the shells that are needed in the fields of war in Ukraine. But somehow they are not required in the military conflict that takes place between Israel and Iran. Israel and Iran have not been involved in ground operations with the use of artillery and shells of the 155th caliber yet. Ukraine has stopped delivery of Pact 3 Patriots, then 155 artillery shells, then GMLRS, Stinger, AIM-7 and Hellfire. Nick Skifrin from Public Broadcasting Service PBS NewsHour reported on this. He added that Deputy White House Press Secretary Annie Kelly explained this step in the following way. This decision was made to put the interests of America in first place. It was made after the review of the Ministry of Defense, military support and assistance. It turned out on our side. On the other side, around the world, there is probably meant Israel. And this is what I like, the strength of the United States Armed Forces remains unchanged. But here I want, in this pointless statement, what kind of defense minister, what kind of deputy press secretary he has to draw attention to himself. How many representatives of the Pentagon made statements in previous administrations, never focused on the fact that the interest of America is placed in the first place? This is clear, but it sounds like a refrain. This is a thesis that has been, in any case, for some time since the beginning of Russian aggression against Ukraine, broadcast from the Kremlin. This is a Russian propagandist thesis by which the Russians justify their illegal actions, violations of international law, the UN Charter. Pay attention that this is done in the national interests, in the first place, the national interests of Russia, sacred. And now the same thesis begins to sound from the mouth of the representatives of the United States Department of Defense in America. And now the last thing. The forces of the United States Armed Forces remain undoubted. Well, if it is undoubted, then what is the matter? Why then stop deliveries, refer to the fact that they carried out the inventory? There are not many of these systems of weapons. Some kind of child's play, a child's play. Many commentators accuse the White House of the fact that it fulfills the will of Vladimir Putin, further reported by Daily Beast, who has been fighting the war for several years, trying to subjugate Ukraine by his will. Everyone attacked Elbridge Colby, the deputy defense minister who took part in the adoption of this decision. I'll tell you more about him. He is such a signature person. He should be known to those who are interested in this issue. The Trump administration is even stopping the delivery of the Patriots, wrote former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul. How disgusting and shameful is this for the leader of the free world? Putin, first of all, under such headlines, wrote his article on this topic. Investigator Daily Beast Julia Davis. And to say Julia Davis is apparently a naturalized American, a naturalized citizen of the United States of America with roots from Ukraine. She does a very large and useful job exposing Russian disinformation, propaganda, active events in the information space of the United States of America. He does a colossal job, just colossal. Politician and editor SD Atlantic, you know, such a newspaper, this is for intellectuals. Norman Ornstein writes, what a shame, he is following Putin's orders again. Well, also the media strategist of the well-known Analytics Center in Washington, which is called the Institute of American Entrepreneurship or American Enterprise Institute. Baikarim Rafai writes, so Trump gives Putin 2 weeks to progress in the truce. Instead, Putin massively escalates the conflict. And our answer to this escalation is to stop the supply of weapons to Ukraine. Unbelievable. In this phrase, in one sentence, the essence of what is happening is actually summed up. That is, it would seem to be a somber, but probably behind this somber lies a real strategy, which is tried to disguise in different press conferences with Different hints, today one, tomorrow another, third, but when you arrange events one after the other, it does not work. It turns out to be a very bad picture. One of the correspondents in Ukraine writes, the influence of Elbridge Colby, to put it simply, will now mean that Russia will be able to kill more Ukrainian civilians than it could kill us if Ukraine had these ammunition that America is now restoring. That is, there is blood on this man, the blood of those civilians, citizens of Ukraine, who will now die because the sky on the side will not be properly protected. But let's figure it out. Elbridge Colby, who is he? Why, is it really him, or is he alone? Here, around this character, there are already such theories that maybe he was deliberately sent away from somewhere to this administration, and with a special task, so he does it. Well, let's take a short walk. Such an iconic character, we will meet him later. Elbridge Andrew Colby. This is the grandson of former CIA Director William Colby, who was in charge of this post in Nixon's and Ford's administration. The CIA director was very busy. He had the idea that the U.S. intelligence, in particular the CIA, should not be engaged in any sharp intelligence operations. It should look like a gentleman's club, like in smokings or frags, gastok babochka. So they sit, smoke a pipe and a cigarette, and come to some fantastic, correct, ideal, analytical conclusion. So he sat on this position, finished his job, and somehow he strangely died. He had a habit of swimming in the morning on a boat in the area of Washington. Sometimes there is quite a stormy current there. One day he swam and did not come back, so he was not found. That is, the former director of the CIA just disappeared like this. His son, that is, not a son but a grandson, was born in Japan, received a brilliant education, graduated from Harvard, studied at Yale University. He was a specialist in a wide profile, mainly in Europe and China. With Trump, he was already in the second administration, that is, he was not dissented. That is, right now, in order to make this particular decision, he was with Trump since 2017 or 2018 in Pentagon. At that time, he was a deputy assistant to the Minister of Defense on strategy. That is, this is an important question. That is, this is a person who solves strategic questions about where to deploy his combat power to the American armed forces. Now he is in charge, now he is the undersecretary, this is a deputy. The Minister of Defense on politics, this is the most important question. That is the most important thing now, I mean who the Minister of Defense is, who does not know all this about strategy and so on. And this one, apparently, is the one who solves these issues. With a glance at, of course, the White House, at President Trump, he plays a central role in the formation of defense strategies of the United States of America. And he was one of the main authors of the National Defense Strategy of the 18th, back then, in the first administration. He is a leading supporter of the so-called realistic approach to foreign policy, which emphasizes the need to pay priority attention to China's restraint. And the main thing is that our interest in the United States of America and Europe and Russia is so-so. We need to turn this whole thing around and not interfere here. I paid attention to you. I have been following this thesis for a long time. Knowing how bureaucracy works, it works approximately the same in the field of national security. What is in the Soviet Union? What is in the United States of America? What is in Great Britain? My deep conviction is that this thesis and those who are behind it, that the most important thing is China, so we need to close our eyes on Putin, what he is doing in Ukraine, and even on Europe. This is the explanation of those who do not want to do anything, who do not want to make an important decision, a sharp, important, responsible decision. Now all this is transferred to an unfavorable object. An unfavorable object is that we must pay attention to Southeast Asia, and here it is, the second administration. How did they pay attention, focus their attention on China in the first administration of Trump? Not at all, and now they will not do anything at all. How did they not build American ships? Because there are no corresponding forces on the ropes. How will they not be built? And so China is moving forward in this area. What is needed for Southeast Asia? It is this air-to-sea power. In short, this is a deterrence. That is, a person who will not do anything. Will write unnecessary papers from one office to another, from another to the third, and so on. At this time, Putin will be engaged in his own business for the whole Western world in Europe. He openly spoke against the U.S. military interference in the Middle East. He was a fierce critic of the first administration of the U.S. aid to Ukraine. And when he was appointed to the current position in the Senate committee, he was subjected to a fierce interrogation from the senators, including Republicans but mainly Democrats. In the course of the hearing, he repeatedly refused to directly ask a direct question. Did Russia invade Ukraine or not? He was able to squeeze out that Russia crossed the border. That is, he could not even say that it was an invasion, not to mention aggression. For a long time, he was murmured about this issue. In the end, he said that this is a very delicate diplomatic process due to the fact that peaceful negotiations between the United States and Russia under the leadership of President Trump continue, but they have not started yet. It was the very beginning of Trump's administration, and he would not want to make a statement that could slow down this process. Well, the senators demanded that Russia be recognized as an aggressor to condemn it. He avoided these questions by saying that he does not consider it appropriate to comment on the situation. The senators called him a hypocrite in response and claimed that his refusal to declare a known fact of aggression on the part of Russia does not undermine his authority as an honest and decent person, and even a professional. Some compared his defiance with the denial of historical facts, that is, the aggression of Russia with the denial, let's say, that Hitler made aggression against Poland. The senators said that Putin did the same thing to Ukraine, the same thing that Hitler did to Poland. But in the end, Kolb, under the scourge of questions, admitted that Russia was in fact in Ukraine. But he avoided to call it an invasion and to call Putin a military criminal. It is reported that Kolb's approach reflects his well-known, that is, he adhered to this throughout his career. His career was in the State Department and in the Pentagon almost all his life. It reflected his broader philosophy of foreign policy that the main thing for the United States is competition with China, and it is necessary to avoid actions that may complicate diplomatic negotiations. Well, this concerns the actions of Russia in Ukraine. That is, this is a well-known person, well-known by his views. He is now being inscribed on him by the resolution. I would say, well, here they say, nasty, treacherous, to stop the supply of weapons to Ukraine at the most necessary, at the most responsible moment. But I will tell you this, in spite of all his importance, his position, and the role he is now playing in the Pentagon, he himself would never have made this decision. In fact, he could have accepted it, but it would have been ignored. And so, I believe that at the moment, this is a decoy, and the decision was made in the White House. Well, that's right, I gave you an example. One of the American journalists wrote that it was followed after Trump had a good conversation with Zelensky, promised to consider the possibility of the supply of additional batteries. He will, and that's how it all ended. This is probably the strategy. Let's look at another material that I wanted to present to your attention on the pages of Foreign Policy. This is one of the most respected authoritative journals in the field of foreign policy in the world, in the United States, in America. Serious people are printed there. So, an honorary scientific officer of the Atlantic Council. My Ukrainian listeners probably know what this council is. One of the leading specialists in Ukraine is the former ambassador to the United States in Ukraine, in general, a very strong and respected analytical center. So here is his scientific assistant, Michael Carpenter, who was a special assistant to the President, Senior Director of Europe at the Council of National Security of the United States, and also a permanent representative of the United States in the Embassy Organization. His name is Michael Carpenter, and so he laid out his vision for the current state of the confrontation between Ukraine and Russia's aggressor, and what can be done to make the situation better for Ukraine and for Ukraine, as he says, to achieve strategic victory. He believes that this is possible and what needs to be done for this. First, as he believes, the basis of the current policy of the Trump administration in relation to Ukraine lies in the following factors. First, confidence in the immediate victory of Russia. Trump came up with this. Who advised him? Who told him this on the phone? Most likely, Putin was the main source of information for him. He shared his thoughts, so to speak, and instructed or expanded Trump's view of Russia in numerous phone conversations that Trump had when he was between the two presidents. That is, Trump and the key employees that he then hired, who solved the relevant issues about Russia and Ukraine, they were confident. Many of them are still confident in the fast victory of Russia, and it must be said that this is a colossal success. Not only on the battlefield, because the situation on the battlefield is proven vice versa. This is what all military experts in the West are talking about. That is, there Russia suffers despite the fact that there it is moving. It threatens the territory by meters, by tens of meters, spending a huge amount of life force on it. Russia is losing there. Strategically, it has already lost. But she managed to wash her ears, her brains, as apparently to President Trump himself, as well as a number of people in his environment. From here, a couple of women's moods arose, like, but if Russia still wins, it is big, its economy is big, there is more life force, and its GDP is big. So what is being spent then? Americans do not like to invest money, especially businessmen who consider themselves Trump. In this country, the same American businessman will spend money on a failed project. That is, first, disinformation appears in the head, which takes over his mind, brings him to the corresponding conclusions, and then, based on these, wrong conclusions that Russia will still win, a couple of women's moods arise. Therefore, apparently somewhere in Trump, no matter what he says now, somewhere there he has a temper already on the verge of instinct, or, as the Americans say, God-fearing, that is, this feeling that is born in the intestines. It cannot be stopped by Putin, but in fact, as the author writes, the reason why Ukraine has not yet won over Russia, although it could have won, is not in the fact that victory over Russia is inevitable, but in the fact that the West and, above all, the United States of America did not provide enough military aid. Not on time, not in those quantities, and not of that quality. And this was the main reason why this happened. Because in the decisive moments, if this aid had gone on time, so to speak, this was an expensive spoon for a lunch, and precisely the use of those characteristics that were then required, the situation would have been, in fact. That is, once again, this is not a shortcoming of the living force in Ukraine, or the inability to fight there. This is a shortcoming of Western military assistance and the restriction of Western sanctions against Russia. Nevertheless, time was lost to some extent, although not. The fact that Russia has already suffered a strategic defeat is a great merit of Ukraine and its armed forces. Time was lost in the sense that the victory could, that is, in fact, the West, without giving assistance at the right time. He has torn out the current situation of uncertainty and saved the victory of Ukraine, but the victory is still possible, writes the author. The main conditions for this, as you think. What needs to be done? Quite practical suggestions. First, it is necessary to finally confiscate these $300 billion. The further he addresses both the United States and Europe, the further he goes into details, the more his address is addressed exclusively to Europe. That is, apparently, he understands that this gut instinct of Trump now will be difficult to reconstruct. And Europe is its destiny. Its security depends on how Ukraine will end this war with Russia. And the main problem, that is, there is already an understanding of Europe what to do to increase aid. For this you need to increase funding. But as many European leaders say, we know what to do, we can do it, probably we will do it. But then the most important question is how to re-elect ourselves after we have done all this. I mean, the people after 3 years of the war, since the beginning of the war, Russian aggression against Ukraine, European peoples, which are central and further there, traditional, so to speak, Europe, not Eastern, the people there are not ready. They are not yet enough to accurately assess the dangerous situation, and the costs of defense will increase, the help of Ukraine will increase. Inflation will grow, salaries will fall, and the popularity of the right parties will grow, which are close to Putin, and Russia is able to play with dissatisfaction. There is a danger of the emergence of the coming of power in this European party, as in Hungary, as Slovakia, which works not so much for Europe as for the Kremlin. That's why he addresses Europe first, because I remind you that the Biden administration, the money that was frozen in the Central Bank of Russia on the territory of the United States of America, they were confiscated by the Biden administration and transferred to Ukraine. What's left in Europe is $300 billion. What are we going to spend it on? But naturally on arms, the supply of arms is once, but this is not enough. The joint development of the Ukrainian defense complex plus the corresponding Western European countries. In other words, in the process of this cooperation, Ukraine must become an integrated part of the European military industry complex, oriented to the latest technologies. And this will save Ukraine from the danger of these changes in the political moods of the local population in Europe and the unusual elections that can lead to the power of one or the other. As the author writes, Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated its ability to compensate for its difficulties with the weapons it receives from the West and with financing, with the help of asymmetric means. Asymmetric means is the intellect that I was talking about. Thank God, Ukraine has its allies. These are the corresponding corporations that work on the forefront of scientific progress of artificial intelligence. Russia has been in this area for several years and it has already moved to the next century. Russia is still struggling in the previous one, but it is coming out, but to a significant extent lags behind Ukraine. This is what will need to be developed with the help of these $300 billion, first of all. Then it will be necessary to increase the serious sanctions on Russia from the side of the West. But here again, he addresses the West as a debtor. The West is a debtor. And he publishes this article at a time when the Trump administration just quietly, without noise, without dust, removed a number of Russian banks from sanctions in order for them to carry out transactions in the development of a peaceful atom. How will Europe compensate for all this? I don't know. He does not give an answer to this question. He believes that the goal of the West should be the exclusion of all Russian banks and the SWIFT system, and it is necessary to subject them to complete blocking. Finally, it is necessary to establish maximum control over the export of high-tech components in order to further limit Russia's access to goods of double purpose. Another circumstance that I would like to add here is that the author does not have this. It is very important for Europe. This is what Europe can do on its own. It can break the possibility of a joint, cheap, multi-billion project between Putin and Trump. Putin has a significant influence on Trump in the scope of his influence in the background. As I said, one of these projects is an idea to take control of the North Stream and to let Russian gas through it, and to force Europe to take this gas and again sit on the Russian needle. And if this happens, then the party of Western Europe will strategically be completely failed. Therefore, she laid out the 18th package, a position that forbids any citizens, organizations, companies of Western Europe to have some kind of relationship with these North Streams and with Russian gas if Putin and Trump try to launch it through these pipes. The third factor is Chinese. The author believes that it is necessary, one way or another, to do a lot of work with China in order for China to cease to be the main source of financial, material, and technological support in this war, because according to his information, already by the end of 1922, Russia was not very close to the zero level of high-tech weapons. It was already cutting out. Putin started the war without enough ammunition, high-precision missiles, and then came to help China, which is the main supplier of all kinds of chips that are needed for the production of these missiles. I told you that there were good conditions for finding a common language with China in this area, conditions after the strikes of Israel and the United States on nuclear objects of Iran. And contrary to the fears that China can rekindle and take some actions, and he could, in any case, could take serious diplomatic actions, in fact, he did not do anything. Who allowed a serious analyst in the West to come to the conclusion that for China it is much more important to present at this stage economic relations with Europe and the United States of America than with Putin. For Putin, for Xi Jinping, he plays the role of a dog who barks at the neighbor, delivering Xi Jinping's pleasure to the neighbor. This is Western Europe. But China cannot change relations with Putin in relation to Western Europe. And this led Western analysts to think that it opens up opportunities, including for Western Europe, to reach the relevant agreements on limiting the use of China, technology, and the rest of Russia. Thus, the task is as follows: to turn the situation around. Putin's desire to dominate Ukraine is unlikely to ever weaken, even though the number of Russian victims has already exceeded 1 million. Only conditions on the battlefield and in the defense industry that will make Putin's ambitions unrealistic. This is the situation on the battlefield and in the defense industry. Western countries, he says Western, but probably he means, first of all, Western Europe, in light of the last actions of the Trump administration. So Western countries, Europe, have collective resources to create a situation in which Russia's tendencies will become negative. Well, indeed, the GDP, if I'm not mistaken, the European Union is about 40 times more than the GDP of Russia. Well, what are we talking about? And Western Europe, NATO countries, EU countries, they spend on defense about 0.1% of their GDP. While Russia is almost 50%, and at the same time, the depraved Western European population who is afraid of Putin, afraid of this crazy Russia. They somehow feel uncomfortable when the conversation begins that instead of 0.1%, it is necessary to increase to 0.2% GDP. That is, it would seem, like a mosquito's snot. Nevertheless, they still cannot be resolved, as the author believes, but I have the impression that it has already moved there. With the arrival of Chancellor Merkel, Germany took over the leadership. Poland plays a very active and positive role, actually a new leader of Europe. And I liked this phrase, which was said by the Minister of Foreign Affairs Sikorsky, that they awakened a sleeping lion or beast. That is, it was done by Putin, but it was actually done by Trump when he actually stopped real participation in NATO, and now it is interrupted by the help of Ukraine. I see the situation like this. Europe has no other way out. That is, there, at the level of the political elite, they have already understood, and it is not necessary to prove that Russia, in the event of a victory in Ukraine, will not stop. It will get worse. You just need to be able to do what the elite of Western Europe declares. But it is still doing it with a glance at the electorate. As Z.H. Vonsky said, it is necessary to work more carefully with the electorate and explain the situation to him. It's not strange, I called you here an American journalist of Ukrainian origin, Julia Davis. She regularly on her website, on her Facebook page, publishes very successful excerpts or episodes. From the Sullivan-Appomattox show, when a group gathered there, led by the chief Sullivan-Appomattox, splashed saliva on the fact that it is necessary to throw a nuclear bomb on Paris, London. Wash the Great Britain off the face of the earth, it should be shown more often. Probably they think that their saliva, splashes of saliva, will frighten a Western citizen. I think it's useless. The same thing should be done in Germany and France and Great Britain. The people should understand that they are dealing not with normal people, but with completely zombified representatives of a stupid human race. As the author writes, from a strategic point of view, Russia has already lost this war. Regardless of how much more territory will be transferred from hand to hand, the Ukrainian nation for Russia is lost forever. No matter how many $billions Russia has spent on propaganda and re-education, camps of infiltration, torture chambers, it will never convince the Ukrainians to take its power as legitimate. This thought, I believe, should become the main thesis or message of Ukraine to the West. To the West, in the face of the head of the government, the state of the West, and voters of the people. That the Ukrainian nation is lost forever for Russia. European security, the security of the continent, is put on the map of the present time, and it depends on Ukraine. Therefore, the author believes Europe must be obliged, it will not go anywhere, it must help Ukraine to break the situation. So I repeat a little thesis on what needs to be done from his point of view in order to break the situation. Confiscate 300 billion, activate the integration of Ukraine into the military-industrial complex of Europe, and ensure the uninterrupted supply of the latest weapons systems. Increase the distance pressure on Russia and put the issue on the edge in front of China. Then he ends with the following thought: a peaceful agreement between Russia and Ukraine can remain unattainable. But when the price of continuing military actions becomes unbearable for Russia, in the end, the Kremlin will have to agree to a truce, similar to the one that actually put an end to the war in Korea. As soon as this moment comes and the military actions are weakened, Ukraine will have a space to renew its democratic mandate, namely the resettlement of refugees, the restoration of infrastructure, and perhaps most importantly, the completion of the process of joining the EU and NATO. The return of all occupied territories may take longer, but Ukraine will lay the foundation for strategic victory. I believe that everything that is laid out here is quite correct. In light of the latest actions, I have prepared you for this in my previous videos that, in the end, the help stream from Washington will come to an end. It would be possible, of course, to do this more softly and for a longer period of time so as not to make it so painful. But as they say, on the war, so on the war. But the task set here, the VSU fully fulfills its task on the battlefield. That's all that's listed here. This is the task of Ukrainian diplomacy and, in general, of the Ukrainian authorities. This is both diplomacy and this massive information offensive, because somehow it does not exist. No, Julia Davis, a wonderful Ukrainian girl here, she is one, in fact, who is doing this great work on the propaganda of the, or rather, on the disclosure of what is happening in the rubble of Kremlin propaganda. It is necessary to do the same information offensive in Western Europe. In conclusion, dear friends, I received several questions about commenting on the news in the media about the alleged coming mass deportation from the United States, which will include even naturalized citizens. Well, let's bring some clarity to this question. The question, in my opinion, first of all arose in connection with the fact that at the post of the new mayor of New York from the Democratic Party, the naturalized citizen of the United States became Zoran Mamdani. At the age of 7, his parents brought him from Uganda, the parents of the Indians themselves. In general, he grew up here for 7 years. He took active part in activities at the bottom level of the Democratic Party. And suddenly, such a stormy, unpredictable development in the last years of the U.S. political situation brought him to the 9th wave of the war between Democrats and Republicans. He won from a very serious opponent from the Democratic Party. Now, there will be elections in November, where he will be against the Republican candidate. Well, this news made the magician shudder. Some representatives won. Senator, I don't remember his name, the senator of the United States began to shout that he should be deported. It seems even Trump said that this Mamdani was here illegally, that is, we deported him. And then a memorandum came up. Memorandum that was signed on June 11 of this year, and it was signed by Brad Shumate, Assistant to the Attorney General of the United States of America. That is, first this document was signed, then a scandal broke out of this Mamdani, and threats fell on the fact that it should be deported. They're the same company turned its support, in which Benny Sanders entered, said that we would become a mountain for him. In short, he can be known here as an example or a symbol of the struggle between forces, conditionally speaking, of good and the forces of evil. So, the memorandum. And then there were fears that, well, now that's it, if they deported him, that is, they would take away his citizenship and deport him, then everything would threaten everyone else. This memorandum appeared, let me comment on it. It is about priorities, as they say here, about priorities that the department will adhere to in civil affairs of the Ministry of Justice. In the first part, it is said how important it is that all kinds of declarators who provide information to the government agencies of the United States of America do not provide false information. That is, the government, in the face of the Ministry of Justice, apparently will fight uncompromisingly with all such statements by fraud, that is, which will be equated with fraud. And then there is a page in which it is said that the Department of Civil Rights of the Ministry of Justice as one of the priorities will consider the procedure of denaturalization. That is, this is the deprivation of citizenship, acquired citizenship in all cases that are provided by law and which is reinforced by evidence, facts. That is, this is not that now they took it all, blinded it, came up with new laws, another procedure, everything that is here, I will read further. I know this fact as a fact because I participated quite actively in all these procedures of providing a political refuge, which then, after a while, after a few years, turns into a green card. Then citizenship and so on. That is, I know this as a fact. Here are the foundations on the basis of which it is possible to potentially deprive a person of citizenship. Citizenship is deprived and deported. All these laws, except for the last point on which I pay special attention. All these foundations existed even earlier for many years. That is, there is nothing new here. Among the foundations for solving citizenship, it is listed, citizens who committed crimes for which they are sentenced as felony. That is, they are sentenced as felons. Felony is a serious crime. What is a serious crime in different places, in different states, in different places? There are some nuances. Well, this is 5+ years, 5 years and more. This is felony, although sometimes it is less. What kinds of crimes are involved? The list, because of which citizenship can be deprived, which is engaged in terrorism, espionage. They are generally a potential threat to national security, including terrorism, espionage, illegal exports of sensitive goods, and technologies to the United States. Then they will transmit information to others which is of interest, or is particularly protected from the point of view of national security. In other words, if someone is identified as a spy, terrorist, or a person who works for the same Russia and transmits forbidden technology, who delivers information to hostile special services on national security issues, he will be judged, he will be sentenced as a felon, and he will be deprived of citizenship and deported. Then cases in which specific persons will be tortured, committing military crimes, other violations of human rights. Well, and so on. That is, you understand what we are talking about. For participation in criminal gangs, for participation in international criminal organizations, drug cartels. Those people who committed felonies before they became citizens, and in the process of obtaining a legal status in the United States of America, they did not report about it. That is, somewhere in Russia a person committed a crime, he has a criminal case against him, he knew about it, came here, asked for a political refuge, and did not report that he has a criminal case there. I must tell you, in practice, in my personal practice, there were cases when people were persecuted, there were criminal cases against them, and this often happens, especially with so-called political crimes. People come here, ask for a political refuge, they say that yes, they are persecuted there, it is clear that they are persecuted because they came here, and they are given a political refuge. Another thing, when there is a criminal behind him, he came here, he hid it all, then it all becomes known, he can be sentenced or simply deprived of citizenship for hiding it. This is a fact, then it concerns those who are engaged in all kinds of beep crimes, serious crimes, who commit serious crimes. They are engaged in drug trafficking, trafficking of people, those who are engaged in fraud, a very important issue. Large financial fraudulent operations in the United States, including operations with checks, fraudulent checks, then fraudulent operations. With loans, with programs of medic aid, medic care, and all. Well, and everything else in the same spirit except the latter. In any other case, which will be considered by the Civil Department and the Ministry of Justice, and which this Civil Department on Civil Affairs will consider that it is quite important in order to deal with this matter. This already opens up additional possibilities outside of the preceding days, but in any case, this should be a felony. This is not a small crime. For the fact that you steal socks or underpants in Walmart, you are unlikely to be deprived of a passport and citizenship. Plus, there must be a process. This is the most important thing. The process here, according to this order, is a special memorandum. It must be considered not in immigration. Now it is still considered in the immigration court. That is, a person is sentenced to felonies in a criminal court in a criminal process. Then he expires. And the case is considered by the immigration court, which makes a decision about deprivation and deportation. And now it will be dealt with by civil courts. According to the procedure in civil courts, a person, if he cannot pay for his lawyer, in immigration courts he must give to the state for his lawyer's account for free. And in civil courts, no, you cannot pay, speak for yourself. Well, the representatives of the immigration services say, well, how can it be? You cannot, in the end, on an important issue, hire a lawyer. In short, here is such a limitation. Well, then the facts are understood, what happened, why it happened. That is, by and large, in such a situation as it was, allegedly, with representatives of the Salvadorian gangs, who, as I understand it, were caught and sent God knows where, and then it turned out that there are no members of these gangs among them, and so on. Such cases should be practically excluded. That is, I do not see such a massive process of denaturalization in the United States of America. Once, I do not see that it will be done in such a way that they will grab on the streets, behind the legs, behind the hands, behind the legs, get on the plane and send God knows where. That is, the procedure, after all, it is a procedure. Well, how long will it last? In general, I must say that many analysts here believe that such a bacchanalia in a significant degree, including in foreign policy, will last here until November next year. Before the elections, as a result of which the situation must rapidly improve, but until it has not improved, we have what we have. I want to tell you to give such a figure only. Now the new budget is being considered for the next financial year. The Senate has accepted it, now they have returned it to the House of Representatives. They will take it, they will vote. But what about immigration? This is important. Now the U.S. Immigration Service, according to the current budget, finances $3.4 billion a year. Not much, the whole ICE is $3.4 billion a year, but in the new budget it will have $150 billion a year. Think about it, a jump from 3.4 to 150 billion a year, and the military budget is somewhere around 900 billion. That is, it is significant by and large. 150 billion for one immigration service is more. Well, almost half of it is more than the budget of the entire intelligence community of the United States of America, including the National Security Agency, the most expensive agency in the country. That is up to 100 billion from 80 to 100, and here all for all, one immigration service 150, and this is from 3.4. Some analysts scream catastrophe. That is, it turns out that this is almost the creation of a police state, but even worse. When black cranes will drive along the roads and cross people right from the street. This reminds me of the horrors of 1937-1939 in the Soviet Union. But if we disassemble 150 billion, so to speak, on shelves, then the situation is not so terrible. It turns out that out of 150 billion, 32 billion will be spent on additional employees of the Immigration Service. That is, their number will increase tremendously. And the impression is that one of the main functions of the Trump administration will be the Immigration Service. What will it do? That is, I would say that 32 billion will be spent on hiring or recruiting new employees. It is possible to increase their salaries. Then 46.5 billion is the construction of this wall with Mexico, cameras, projectors, and everything else. They say that there is already zero, there are no immigrants, that is, there are no illegals. Okay, 46.5 billion will be spent. Then 7 billion will be spent on border guards. 3.3 billion will be spent on hiring new additional judges of immigration courts. This is necessary. This is critically necessary. Because those who are now in the process of considering his immigration status know that some things are waiting. In Afghanistan, people sit for 8–10 years. Judges are needed. It will cost us only $3.3 billion. Then $45 billion is called detention centers for them. They remind very much like prisons, but in a more modest regime. Some say that it will be new to remind a concentration camp in a miniature of $46 billion. That is $45 billion. Yes, this is strong, of course. That is, the planners who created this budget, they probably believe that there will be a sufficient number of people who must settle. These concentration camps or special prisons for immigrants. Well, $5 billion is probably on the border of immigration, and $13.5 billion will be paid by a separate state for what they did for their own account to ensure the protection of the state from illegal immigrants. That's all. 150 is serious. If this is the biggest intelligence of the United States, then it is more than FBR. Counterintelligence, national security is less important from the point of view of the budgetary views of the Trump administration than the issue of immigrants. That is, the impression is that they are going to expel all those who have been hired here from the countries of the Third World, Latin America, for all the past years. But I repeat, the procedure must still act, the courts must still act. And so, about the courts, I have repeatedly emphasized the smart thought of one of my friends, an experienced American lawyer who told me many years ago, around the beginning of the first half of the 1990s. He said that American democracy is held on the map, he said then, on the independence of the judicial system. Because he already believed then executive power is corrupt, in the legislative power he pointed his finger at Congress, there are clowns. But independent judicial power is the last support for democracy in the United States of America. We will hope that it will work. For now, it is necessary to say that it will work. The last decision of the Supreme Court, which limits the decision of local judges, who suspended the action of the President of the United States, on the entire territory of the United States is now limited. It makes sense. Because a local judge somewhere in the U.S. in Ljubljana makes a decision and says that it is obligatory for the execution of the president's decree on the entire territory of the United States. This is probably too much, but in principle the judicial power is still holding on. We hope that it will continue to hold on. On this, dear friends, let me finish today's long-awaited issue. Glory to Ukraine by the armed forces. The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours. To you, dear friends, for your perseverance and firm faith in our inevitable victory. See you soon.